Good morning. My name is Alex Schadenberg. I'm the Executive Director of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition. We have a press conference talking about Bill C-62. As you know, it passed through Parliament. It is right now in the Senate. I have three speakers here today. Leah Milousis is a human rights lawyer here in Ottawa. Dr. Paul Saba is a family physician in Montreal. And Ed Fast is the Member of Parliament who had championed Bill C-314 in the earlier part of the session. And he'll talk a little bit about this whole thing about euthanasia for mental illness alone. So I'm going to go straight to Leah, who has a story to tell us about her own personal experiences.
Thank you very much, Alex, and thank you to those who are listening. I approach this issue of medical assistance in dying or euthanasia-assisted suicide really historically from a place as a lawyer. I'm a human rights lawyer, and I have followed the Carter decision, the Truchon decision. I've followed the legislation through the various stages, Bill C-14 and C-7. And there was a point at which, having done a great deal professionally, I realized that I felt as though my voice wasn't being heard. I felt that the concerns of those who struggle with mental health issues weren't being heard. And so despite the stigma associated with struggling with a mental health issue, particularly in the legal profession, I decided that I was going to share my personal story. And my story is one that is difficult to share, but I think is important because it highlights the similarities between the motivations that lead someone to access euthanasia and assisted suicide and the motivations that led me to attempt to take my own life when I was a teenager. The reality is that those who access MAiD struggle with the same hopelessness, despair, and suffering that I am quite familiar with. Obviously, suffering is unique to the individual, and really the suffering of those struggling with a mental health issue is just as meaningful and painful as those struggling with a physical condition. The issue, though, is that it's ultimately about hopelessness. And so when I look at those who are accessing medical assistance in dying, I understand, I have great empathy because I know what it was like for me when I was in that dark place when I was a teenager. Maybe to provide a little bit of information, when I was about 15 years old, 14, 15, I reached a point in my life where very unexpectedly I found that life became very lackluster. There was a monotony to it. It was very tedious, and I often describe it as kind of color just draining from my world and things being very dark. And unless you've been there, it's hard to understand and hard to explain, but that was my experience. And for a period of about 6 months, that was my life. I woke up every day to this amorphous, abstract pain, and it did not take long for me to decide that this was not a reality I wanted to live in. And then there was a period of time after that where things stopped. You know, I recovered, and it seemed as though this was just a single bad season, and I kind of moved on with my life. And then depression came back again and again. And there is something very, very scary about realizing that you're facing a condition, you're facing an issue that you don't understand, and you don't know whether it will ever depart. And so, you know, as I mentioned, it did not take long for this pain to be intolerable to me. And I really thought that this would never end, that this was the rest of my life, that my future would be one full of amorphous, abstract, existential suffering. And that was not a future I wanted to be there for. And so within quite a short period of time, approximately 2 years, I attempted to take my life a number of times. And it's important for people to understand that the reason I'm here today is not because I wasn't motivated to take my own life and end my suffering. It was because I didn't have access to the information and the methods that would actually accomplish that goal. And because I didn't have access to those things, I now am here today, and I have come out of that darkness. I've continued to struggle, but I've reached a point in my life where I realized that depression lied to me when it said that the pain would exist perpetually, that it would never stop. And it was also, I've come to a place where I believe that a life, even one with immense suffering, is still a life worth living, and I believe that for every Canadian. And so, having reached this point, I find it deeply disturbing to see that our society is moving to a place where it would offer suicide assistance to those who really need suicide prevention. You know, I was someone who didn't have access and didn't want medical intervention by nature of my condition. And so I very easily could have accessed this. Many people have told me I wouldn't qualify, but I was an intelligent, conscientious, and motivated young person. And I have no question that if medical assistance in dying from mental illness had been available when I was in high school and university in those years that I struggled, that I would not be here today. And so while I'm very thankful that our nation is discussing and hopefully passing a delay of 3 years, I really would call on politicians and call on society to consider the message that we're portraying to those who are struggling with their mental health. The nature of their mental health condition is one that sabotages their survival instinct. It distorts reality. It prevents them from being able to see a future of hope and meaning. And I would suggest that instead of drawing close to those people and saying, maybe it's true, maybe there isn't hope for you, maybe it's not worth continuing to struggle and through suffering. Instead of saying that, we should draw near to those who are suffering. We should suffer with them, affirm the inherent dignity and value of their life, and we should offer suicide prevention, not suicide assistance. We should offer a message of meaning and purpose and hope. And my hope is that that is what society will shift back to doing. And I thank those politicians like the Honourable Ed Fast for their efforts to advance a message of hope, because when I was in that dark place, and if that was the message that I needed, and if I was ever in that place again, that would be the message that I would want, a message of hope. Thank you.
Introduce yourself again.
Yeah, my name is Dr. Paul Saba. Mon nom est Dr. Paul Saba. Je suis médecin de famille à Montréal. Et je veux vous faire savoir qu'à partir du 17 mars 2024, les Canadiens avec des problèmes de santé mentale pourront avoir accès à l'euthanasie. Au Canada, on appelle l'euthanasie l'aide médicale à mourir. Cela ne doit pas se produire. Ce n'est pas une aide médicale à mourir dont les gens ont besoin, mais plutôt une aide médicale à vivre. Environ 1 personne sur 5 aura une maladie mentale au cours de sa vie. Moins de la moitié d'entre elles chercheront à obtenir une aide professionnelle. La récente pandémie a aggravé des problèmes de santé mentale, surtout pour les marginalisés, les femmes, les jeunes adultes, les pauvres et les personnes avec des problèmes de santé mentale. Plus de 50% des personnes reçoivent des soins de santé mentale de leur médecin de famille, comme moi, souvent sans l'aide d'autres intervenants. Notre système de santé et social est déficient pour les personnes avec des problèmes de santé mentale. Selon le sondage d'Institut Angus Reid, la plupart des Canadiens ne soutiennent pas l'aide médicale à mourir pour les maladies mentales et souhaitent une amélioration des soins de santé mentale. Ici au Québec, où je vis, le temps d'attente moyen entre la consultation d'un psychiatre et le traitement est environ 5 mois. Cependant, la nouvelle loi exige une période d'attente seulement de 3 mois avant que l'euthanasie ne soit administrée. Donc, terme, la personne qui souhaite consulter un psychiatre sera morte depuis longtemps avant d'obtenir un rendez-vous avec le psychiatre. Il y a toujours une raison pour vivre, mais en tant que soignant, nous devons trouver cette raison pour que la personne veuille vivre. Personne ne veut pas mourir. Les gens veulent plutôt échapper à leur détresse émotionnelle. Nous devons les aider dans leur détresse. La plupart des psychiatres ne sont pas favorables à la légalisation de l'euthanasie pour les malades mentaux en raison des risques accrus pour certains groupes tels que les femmes, les jeunes adultes, les pauvres et d'autres groupes marginalisés. En outre, les psychiatres souvent ne sont pas d'accord que le patient est irrémédiable. D'un point de vue juridique, la demande d'aide médicale à mourir pour les malades mentaux ne remplit pas la condition de consentement libre et éclairé. Plus une personne vit avec une maladie mentale, moins elle est apte de donner un consentement libre et éclairé. Comme société, nous avons la responsabilité d'améliorer notre système de soins de santé pour les personnes atteintes de problèmes de santé mentale. Il faut assurer un accès rapide aux psychiatres, aux psychologues et autres travailleurs sociaux. Il faut garantir l'accès à une grande variété de traitements, y compris l'art, la musique, la danse, les animaux, les loisirs et d'autres thérapies. Nous devons également garantir la gratuité des médicaments. un logement abordable et une sécurité alimentaire. Comme société, nous devons offrir les meilleurs soins aux personnes avec des problèmes de santé mentale. Nous devons les soigner et non les tuer par l'euthanasie ou la suicide assisté. No one really wants to die. People just want to end their psychological distress. We have to help them in their distress. According to a Harvard study, 9 out of 10 people who attempted suicide but were unsuccessful in their attempt did not commit suicide following treatment. The study found that with the right treatment and support, people don't want to die. Most psychiatrists do not support the legalization of euthanasia for the mentally ill because of the increased risk for certain groups such as women, young adults, the poor, and the marginalized. Also, psychiatrists cannot agree who is irremediable. From a legal standpoint, the request for medical assistance in dying for those with mental illness does not meet the condition of free and informed consent. The more a person lives with a mental illness, the less capable they're able of giving free and informed consent. In Canada, we have a responsibility to improve our healthcare system for people with mental health problems. This includes assuring access to psychiatrists, psychologists, and social workers. We must ensure access to a wide variety of alternative treatments, including art, music, dance, pet, recreation, and other therapies. Furthermore, we must ensure free medications, affordable housing, and food security. All of these services, treatments, and social supports are not available at the present time for the majority of our fellow Canadians with mental illness. As a society, we must offer the best care to treat people with mental health problems. We must care for them and not kill them through medical aid in dying.
Honorable Ed Fast.
Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this press conference discussing the state of MAiD in Canada. I want to thank Leah for her poignant story and a story of hope, and Dr. Saba for your comments as well. Thank you. I'm Ed Fast, a Member of Parliament for Abbotsford, British Columbia. I was the Member of Parliament who brought forward the bill, C-314, that would have put a stop to any further expansion of MAiD in Canada and would have protected the mentally ill in Canada against this expansive approach to medical assistance in dying. Now, many of you will know when the Carter decision came down and Bill C-14 was introduced in the House of Commons, we were provided with assurances that this was an extraordinary remedy. MAiD, medical assistance in dying, was an extraordinary remedy and was constrained by the Carter decision's conditions and limitations. But even at that time, I remember speaking in the House, and many of my colleagues in the House of Commons spoke, and we warned of a slippery slope and the risk of expansion to the most vulnerable within our society. And Dr. Saba has already addressed much of that, and that has happened. But at that time, we were accused of fear-mongering and of exaggeration. And it turns out that we were right. We are now witnessing an unimaginable expansion of MAiD to include more and more of our most vulnerable citizens. These are our mentally ill brothers and sisters, children, the opioid addicted, the homeless, the hungry, even our veterans. And don't forget our Indigenous communities, which are perhaps at most and greatest risk from MAiD. We as a society are struggling to provide the basic necessities of life to these vulnerable individuals, as Dr. Saba has already mentioned. And this is being exacerbated by national crises in mental health, opioid addiction, palliative care, homelessness, and general affordability. And the solution cannot and should not be more death and abandonment. Our steadfast commitment should be to allow our most vulnerable to live with dignity. Assisted death for the mentally ill is not health care, especially when the mental health community has been unable to agree on whether irremediability can ever be determined when evaluating a mental illness. That has been a repeated refrain across Canada within the mental health community, and certainly at the joint Senate House of Commons committee that went back and reviewed the state of readiness for MAiD for the mentally ill in Canada. How many lives will be lost that could have been helped and restored? And Leah is a perfect example of that. And thank you, Leah, for persevering and for sharing your story about your journey. Now, I also want to note that distinguishing between suicidal thoughts and a rational choice to choose death is something that the mental health community has never been able to agree on. This is an outstanding issue. How is it that we as parliamentarians have repeatedly supported a strong national suicide prevention program, including a newly established 988 helpline, when in the same breath we advocate for the euthanization of these very same individuals? There is no national consensus in Canada to expand MAiD beyond the limitations of the current regime, which is why I joined these organizations and many others across Canada who are calling for this government to put a full stop to MAiD expansion. Now, I also wanted to add a note about the committee process. When I brought forward my Bill C-314, I received assurances from many of my colleagues in the other parties, and that would include Liberal members of Parliament, who said, Ed, you know what, I'll be supporting your bill. It makes sense to put a stop to any further expansion of MAiD. Unfortunately, something happened along the way. I suspect it may have been the Prime Minister prevailing upon his Liberal MPs not to support my bill, with a promise that a joint committee would be reestablished to reconsider Canada's readiness for MAiD. And my bill failed. And I'm not a sore loser. I don't hold that against anyone. But it points out the fact that the committee that was established was supposed to do a proper job of reviewing Canada's state of readiness for MAiD. Now, you should know that over 900 briefs and other submissions were made to the committee that were never reviewed by us as committee members. Why was that? The time frame that was established for this committee to hold its meetings was so restricted that it was virtually impossible to hear from the vast majority of Canadians that wanted to have their voices heard. And beyond that, what became deeply disturbing is that the government did not even provide the resources necessary to have those submissions, those 900 submissions, translated into our 2 official languages. So we were left with this body of evidence that could never be reviewed by committee members or Canadians at large until after the study was complete, until after the recommendation from the committee came out, together with some dissenting opinions. So I lament the fact that we're in a position where we as parliamentarians are addressing a life and death issue, which has deep, deep consequences for the individual Canadians, vulnerable Canadians who are implicated in this, and that we wouldn't spend the time to do this work properly. In fact, I'll point out that in Canada, there has never been a national debate about the merits of MAiD itself. Now, we're not here to litigate the existing MAiD regime. My focus is making sure the most vulnerable Canadians, that includes our mentally ill, are not captured by this expansive effort to apply MAiD to the vulnerable in our country. So again, I support the initiative of organizations across the country, recognizing that there is no national consensus on this. There's no national consensus even within the mental health community to actually expand MAiD to the mentally ill.
So just to conclude, for the position of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition is obviously that we had welcomed the delay, but we actually oppose the concept of euthanasia for mental illness, the concept of even expanding to this. But we also recognize that we now have in Canada people who are living in poverty, people who are experiencing homelessness, people who are having difficulties receiving medical treatment, who are also dying by MAiD, euthanasia, who would never have even considered to do so otherwise if the law weren't so lax and, how would you say, able to allow these people in these situations. So these are social decisions being made to cause death. And to me, that's completely unacceptable. So not only are we opposed to the euthanasia for mental illness, we're opposed to basically where the country has gone with this, and we recognize that it has to have a total and complete review. Thank you. There must be the odd question. We're happy to take them.
Open the floor to questions.
Yeah. Okay.
You can stay seated.
All right.
Don't worry.
I'm a little confused about Leah's name because in the media advisory it says Garifalia.
Her short form of her name is Leah,
Okay, and how do you spell it?
L-I-A.
Okay, thank you.
If you go with the long name, it confuses everyone, but that's her official name.
Okay, Leah. All right, very good. Thank you.
Do you have any further questions?
No, I've interviewed Mr. Fast before, so.
Was there questions online?
Yeah, I'll just check online. If we have any questions, please use the raise hand function now. I don't have any questions online. If there's anything else you'd like to add.
No. Thank you very much. Can you get a couple pictures of us?